Welcome to Rambam in Depth. Today we're going to be discussing the laws of Parah Adumah, Chapter 2, Halacha Hey. The Rambam there talks about how 7 days before they would burn the Parah Adumah, the red heifer that was used for purification from contact with the dead, a week before that they would prepare the Kohen, who would be burning the Parah Adumah, and every one of these 7 days, they would sprinkle the waters of the Parah Adumah, just in case he became tamei and didn't know about it. The only time they wouldn't have to sprinkle is the 4th day. Doesn't require, because it's not possible that it should be the 3rd day of him becoming impure or the 7th day. But then he says, on Halacha Hey, B'Revi b'Shabbos, on Wednesday, Hayamafrishin Eisai, they would separate him. They wanted that the 4th day should be on a Shabbos. Why is that? Because the sprinkling of the ashes does not push away the Shabbos. The 4th day doesn't require, because the 4th day could not be the 3rd of being tamei, and it can't be the 7th. So leave the 4th day of the separation for Shabbos, because anyhow we can't sprinkle the Parah Adumah on Shabbos. So the question is, this comes from a Gemara in Yumad of Ches Amud Beis, and the Gvuras Ari, the author is the famous Shagas Aryeh, asks the question. He says, why can't they do the sprinkling on Shabbos? Let them bring it into the Azara, into the courtyard of the Beis HaMikdash. And there's a klal, there's a general rule, Ein Shvus B'Mikdash. There are no rabbinical prohibitions of Shabbos in effect in the Beis HaMikdash. And the only reason why you can't do the sprinkling is because it's a Shvus, it's a rabbinical reason, which we'll discuss a little bit later. And since it's only a Shavuos, it is permissible to do it in the Beis HaMikdash. So why can't we just bring it into the Azara? So he doesn't give an answer to this question. One of the Mefarshim in back of the Gemara, called the Cheshek Shleima, gives a very simple answer. He says that we know that the water and the ashes of the Parah Adumah, the person who carries it becomes tamei. In other words, the waters of the Parah Adumah, this is one of the enigmas of the Parah Adumah, that it could make people tamei while it's involved in purification of a person. And you're not allowed to bring something tamei into the Azara. That's the answer given by the Cheshek Shleima. The problem, however, is that not everyone agrees with that premise. According to the Shar HaMelech, one of the commentaries on the Rambam, the law of Ein Shvus B'Mikdash applies not only to the Azara, place where you couldn't bring in something that's tamei, but to the entire Har HaBayis. That's included in the category of Migdash. We have many different contradictions whether the Har HaBayis, the Temple Mount, is considered to be part of the Beis HaMikdash, but it depends. Certain areas it is considered, certain areas it's not. And the Shar Melech maintains that with regard to the Ein Shvus B'Mikdash, there are no rabbinical prohibitions of Shabbos in the Beis HaMikdash that applies to the Har HaBayis as well. And there is no such prohibition of bringing in the waters of the Parah Adumah. So the question still remains, why couldn't they just bring it into the Har HaBayis? And that way they can do the sprinkling on Shabbos. So the Shar HaMelech proposes an answer based on the Gemara in Pesachim. The Gemara in Pesachim says that when we say that Ein Shvus B'Mikdash, that's only for something that is right now. We're talking about today. There's a benefit that we have today, and it involves a Shvus. It's overridden by the fact that it's in the Beis HaMikdash. But when you're talking about something that's rachik, something that's in the distance, you're doing something on Yontif, for example, for the purpose of a Shabbos later, the Gemara in Pesachim says, then we do not say Ein Shvus B'Mikdash. Therefore, here also, when you're sprinkling the waters of the Parah Adumah, you're doing it now for the purpose of burning the Parah Adumah later. It's not for what we need. It's not something that's necessary for today, and therefore we don't say Ein Shvus B'Migdash. And one could argue about that premise because one could say that the whole idea that you're supposed to sprinkle the 7 days, that the Kohen is separated, that we derive from Miluyim, from the way that they initiated the base of the Mishkan. Also, there was done for 7 days. And one could say that each day has its own significance in its own right, not just for what's going to happen later. At any rate, that's the answer of the Shah HaMelech. One could have thought of another answer based on something that the Rebbe explains in Hilchos Beis Bechira, where the Rambam, at the very end, talks about how they would go throughout the Beis HaMikdash to inspect it, and they would use torches to go around inspecting, but they wouldn't do it on Shabbos. So they would rely on the fire that was there from before Shabbos. So the question is asked, all the commentaries ask, what's the problem with holding the torches on Shabbos? The holding a torch is only a rabbinical prohibition on Shabbos, if you don't light it, and there's no Shavuos b'migdash. And the Rebbe's answer is that the going around to inspecting is part of the kavod of the Beis HaMikdash, part of the honoring of the Beis HaMikdash. It's not an honor to the Beis HaMikdash to do something that is technically a violation of the Shabbos. So even though in the Beis HaMikdash it overrides the prohibitions that are rabbinical, that are shvus, but in the thing that you're doing for the kavod of the Beis HaMikdash, it would be improper. One could perhaps say, although with some difficulty, that here also we're talking about Taharas and Shal Yisrael. There's a famous Gemara, Yerushalmi, that Rashi and Megillah brings, that the reason why we read Parshas HaChedesh before Parshas Parah before Parshas HaChedesh, even though chronologically the Parshas HaChedesh was said on Rosh Chodesh Nisan, and the Parsha Parah Adumah was said on Beis Nisan. So it should go later, but because it's Taharas and Shal Yisrael, the fact that it deals with the purification of the Jewish people, we give it precedence. And the Rambam himself talks about how there were many different milas that they made with regard to the Parah Adumah, and therefore maybe one could argue that to use the heter of Ein Shvus B'Migdash is not appropriate when you're dealing with such an important thing as Taharas and Shal Yisrael. But it's a little bit daichik, a little bit difficult, because the milas that they made for the Parah Adumah all relate to purity and impurity. And here, Shavuos has nothing to do with purity and impurity. So there's another way of answering the question, perhaps. We know that Ein Shvus B'Migdash. What about if there are two Shavuosim? There are two things that prohibit one's action outside of the Beis HaMikdash. What do we do in the case like that? So the truth is that even in two, if the fact that the Torah said that you're doing something that could lead to a prohibition, a biblical prohibition, which is what a shvus is. Why do the Chachamim prohibit certain things? Because it could lead to a violation of a biblical commandment. So they prohibited things that you do. For example, you can't grind spices on Shabbos, herbs on Shabbos for medicinal purposes. That's min Torah. That's why you shouldn't take certain medications on Shabbos. There are exceptions, of course, to that rule, but generally speaking, why? Maybe you'll grind the samimonim. So when you have two shvusim, two reasons to make something prohibited, we still say ein shvus b'migdash, even though it's two. However, Rabbi Kiva Eger is mechadish that when one act, one shvus, leads to two different outcomes that each one are forbidden, like something that could lead to gerushin and kedushin. Either one, you can't do gerushin and kedushin on Shabbos. And if one act leads to both gerushin and kedushin, then we do say the yeshvus b'migdash. Perhaps we can extend that further. When the two shvusim are of a different nature, We can also say, in this case, yesh shvus b'migdash. What am I talking about? What's the reason you can't do hazaya? You can't do the sprinkling on Shabbos. What's the shvus? So the Gemara in Psachim says, because Shema Yavirenu Dalet Amis, Daf Samaches, Shema Yavirenu Dalet Amis, he might carry it. Same chashash that we have, that we don't blow shofar on Rosh Hashanah Shechaliyas b'Shabbos and Lulav and Megillah. The Gzeira de Rabba, the Gemara refers to it as such. But there's also a Rashi, and it seems from the Rambam as well, that the Isser of Hazaya is Tikuni Gavra. It's like fixing something, which you're not allowed to do on Shabbos, because you're taking a person who's Tameh and rendering him fixed, that he's able to do whatever a person who's not Tameh can do. And that's like making a keli. That's a rabbinical thing. So there are two reasons, and the Mefarshim try to understand why we need two reasons, but the fact is that there are two reasons. So when a person does the Hazaya on Shabbos, there are two shvusim, but there are two different kinds of shvusim. In what way are they different? The shvus of Shema Yavirenu is that this act itself has no resemblance to a biblical mulacha. The fact that you might carry it doesn't mean that what you're doing itself is intrinsically like a mulacha. And then you have another shvus where you're like doing something that even though it isn't a malacha, it resembles a malacha. And in this case, you have both. You have a chsha shema yavirenu, maybe he will carry it in the Rishus HaRabim, but by sprinkling itself, there's no trace of a malacha, no resemblance to a malacha. It could lead to a malacha. That's one kind of shvus. Then you have a second kind of shvus, totally different kind of shvus, that you're fixing something which is resembling a malacha deraisa, making a keli, which is forbidden mideraisa. So because the two shvusim are not similar, they're not just two chshashes, two suspicions that it might lead to something else, but one is a suspicion and one is actually creating a malacha in a resemblance to a malacha, that is. In this case, we don't say ein shvus b'migdash. But be'emes, the whole question of the Shagas Aryeh is hard to understand. Why would we say ein shvus b'migdash by bringing in the hazaya, making the hazaya, the sprinkling in the Beis HaMikdash? It doesn't require, there's no such requirement to bring it in the Beis HaMikdash. There's no kesher between hazaya and the Beis HaMikdash. So just because, and we can do it outside, and it was always done outside, just because one could bring it inside, so they should be able to do it on Shabbos, why would we say ein shvus b'mikdash? But apparently the Shagas Aryeh, who doesn't answer his question, holds that the mere fact that it's in the Beis HaMikdash, even though it doesn't need to be in the Beis HaMikdash, nevertheless, we still say ein shvus b'mikdash. So we have to resort to the other answers according to the Shagas Aryeh.